July 11, 1942, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. The morning orders came in sealed brown folders marked Confidential, Chemical Warfare Service. Most of the men thought it was another training drill. Edgewood Arsenal was known for testing gear, masks, and new kinds of ammunition. No one thought much of it. The Army always had new toys to try. Private Henry Adams, 19, son of a Kansas wheat farmer, adjusted the straps of his M1 helmet as trucks rolled the unit into the testing grounds. The air was heavy, humid, like sweat pressing against skin. In the distance, tall watchtowers and barbed wire marked the perimeter of a field that looked more like a prison yard than a training ground. The crates were already there. Large steel cylinders, marked with strange black letters, Lost and Gelbkreuz. The officers didn't translate, but some of the older NCOs remembered the words from World War I. It meant mustard gas. The same poison that had blinded and burned thousands in the trenches of France. The Germans had named it Lost after the chemists Lommel and Steinkopf. The Americans had captured stockpiles after the last war, and now, 20 years later, they intended to use it again, but not against the enemy. At precisely 0900 hours, Captain Robert Barrow addressed the assembled soldiers. His words were clipped, matter-of-fact, as if he were announcing rifle practice. Men, today you will experience the realities of chemical warfare. This is for your protection, and for the protection of your comrades in the field. Masks on, discipline steady. Remember, this is science. The men exchanged nervous glances. Most had never seen poison gas except in training films. The younger ones, like Adams, had grown up hearing veteran stories of mustard gas attacks in 1918, men screaming, lungs dissolving, eyes scarred blind. And now their own officers were telling them to stand still while the same weapon was released at their feet. The order was given. A valve turned. With a hiss like a rattlesnake, a yellow-brown fog uncoiled from the cylinder, spreading low across the ground. It clung to boots, rolled into socks, slipped between fingers of grass. At first the masks seemed to hold. The soldiers breathed hard, lenses fogging, but mustard gas is not only a vapor. It is liquid on skin. It soaks cloth. It seeps under goggles. Adams felt it first on his neck, where the mask strap cut across bare skin. A hot itch, then a burn, then fire. He tugged at the strap, but it was too late. His skin bubbled in angry welts. To his left, Private Carlos Mendez cursed in Spanish, clawing at his gloves as the chemical burned his wrists. Ahead, a man screamed and dropped to his knees, his uniform darkening where sweat carried the gas deeper. The officers did not move to help. They held clipboards, stopwatches. Time to first reaction, 12 minutes, one muttered. Another scribbled, Negro unit, slower onset of blistering, observe further. The men fell, one by one, coughing, choking, blind. Some ripped their masks off in panic, only to inhale the poison directly. By 0945 hours, 3 were unconscious. 2 more lay twitching, skin peeling like wet paper. The air stank of garlic and sulfur. That afternoon, Adams was carried to the infirmary. His arms were swathed in bandages, yellow pus soaking through. When he begged for morphine, the medic shook his head. Orders say no. They need to record healing rate. Adams screamed until his voice broke. Every sound was written down, every blister measured. Every moment catalogued for science. August 20th, 1942, Bushnell Army Airfield, Florida. The program expanded. Florida's swamps became the next site. This time, the soldiers were told they were testing protective uniforms. They didn't know the uniforms were designed to fail. Inside sealed wooden huts, men stood in canvas gear as officers pumped mustard gas inside. Within minutes, the gas crept through seams and cuffs. Soldiers clawed at their clothes as the chemicals burned through. When the doors opened, they staggered out covered in raw, blistered flesh. Medical officers tore away their shirts and trousers, marking on charts exactly where the burns appeared, underarms, across groins, along the thighs. Each scar became a data point, each wound a statistic. The report typed that night read, effectiveness of impregnated uniform at 20 minutes, partial. Severe dermal penetration observed. Negro units displayed higher resistance to blistering. Recommend further study. Not a single soldier's name appeared, only categories. Negro unit, Puerto Rican detachment, white control. October 3rd, 1942. San Jose Island. Panama on a remote island. More soldiers lined up for what they thought was tropical combat training. Instead, they were locked into dugouts while drums of mustard gas were released. Private John Lewis, a tall kid from Chicago, later tried to write a letter home about it. He described the gas as fire ants under the skin, biting everywhere at once. He wrote how men clawed at their masks, coughed blood, collapsed in the dirt while officers watched from towers. The letter never made it out. Censors intercepted it. It disappeared into the archive. December 5, 1942, Edgewood Arsenal. Maryland Captain Barrow's final report to Washington was typed on crisp paper, filed under confidential. It was clinical. Attached. Mustard gas confirmed as effective casualty agent. Human trials provide clear exposure thresholds. Recommend continued controlled experimentation for protective advancement. It said nothing of Adams, whose arms were scarred for life. Nothing of Mendez, who went blind. Nothing of the dozens coughing blood in infirmaries. The Army called them volunteers. The soldiers called it betrayal. March 11, 1943, Camp Blanding, Florida. The next phase involved sealed chambers. Dozens of men were locked inside airtight rooms as mustard gas was released at lethal concentration. Some lasted an hour. Others collapsed in minutes. The chambers had glass observation windows so officers could watch men stumble, gag, claw at their throats. When the chambers were opened, survivors were dragged out by stretchers, skin sloughing off, eyes clouded white. Doctors hovered with clipboards, recording notes while soldiers screamed. One corporal shouted at the officers, "We signed up to fight Nazis, not to be their lab rats." His voice broke into coughs. He never recovered. April 1943, Edgewood Arsenal. The project files grew thicker. Code names multiplied. Project Shad, chamber trials, uniform tests. Hundreds of soldiers had now been exposed. But the report stripped away every trace of humanity. They didn't write, Private Henry Adams, 19, Kansas farm boy, burned alive. They wrote, Subject A42, moderate blistering, survived. By the end of 1943, more than 4,000 U.S. soldiers had been exposed to mustard gas in controlled tests. Most were never told what had been done to them. Many were sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial. Their wounds lingered in silence. Blisters healed into scars. Lungs wheezed into emphysema. Corneas clouded into blindness. Some developed cancers decades later. The Army called it science. The soldiers called it betrayal, and the irony? In the field of battle, mustard gas was never used by the enemy in WWII. The only men who suffered its sting were America's own. June 22, 1943, Camp Blanding, Florida. The chamber was a steel coffin with windows. 20 men were marched inside, boots echoing against the metal floor. They had been told it was another protective test. They still believed the uniforms would shield them, that the masks would save them. They hadn't yet learned that the experiment was never meant to be survived comfortably. At 0900 hours, the valve turned. Mustard gas hissed into the chamber. The fog curled around their legs, slithered upward. The men held formation, coughing behind the masks. 10 minutes in, the first dropped, clutching his chest. 15 minutes, another man clawed at the door, screaming muffled curses through his mask. At 20 minutes, half were on the ground. Outside, officers with stopwatches scribbled notes. A doctor in a white coat murmured, "Subject endurance is slightly higher than Negro group tested last week." Another officer nodded. The clipboard didn't record names, only categories. Negro unit, Puerto Rican detachment, white control. The chamber filled with cries. The officers didn't move. They only wrote. When the door finally opened, stretchers waited. The survivors were dragged out, skin already blistering, uniforms soaked in poison sweat. Their screams echoed down the corridor as medics peeled cloth from raw flesh. A typed report that evening concluded, protective clothing only partially effective. Racial groups display varying levels of dermal reaction. Further study required. For the men carried back to infirmary cots, there was no further study. Only scars. October 14, 1943, San Jose Island. Panama, the tropics were thick with heat, mosquitoes, and secrets. Dozens of soldiers were ferried onto the remote island, told they would train for Pacific jungle warfare. They were led into dugouts lined with sandbags. When the canisters opened, the poison didn't just burn their skin. It soaked their lungs. They staggered out vomiting blood, their eyes white with chemical burns. Some never walked again. Private John Lewis, whose censored letter had already been confiscated months before, lay in a hammock afterward, wheezing. He asked his sergeant why. The sergeant didn't answer. He only handed him a clipboard and ordered him to sign a form swearing secrecy under the Espionage Act. "Talk, and you'll be court-martialed," the sergeant warned. This never happened. February 2nd, 1944. Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, in a sealed chamber. 6 black soldiers stood side by side in fatigues. Across the hall, 6 white soldiers did the same. The test was identical, 30 minutes of mustard gas exposure. On the clipboards, doctors compared every burn, every blister, every minute until collapse. They wanted to know which race endured longer. One private collapsed in the second minute. Another lasted 20. Notes were written in margins. Higher resilience observed. Possible genetic tolerance. No one wrote the pain. No one wrote the screams. That night, one of the men, a 20-year-old from Alabama, begged the camp medic to tell his family what had happened if he didn't make it home. The medic nodded but said nothing. He knew the papers would never allow it. July 8, 1944, Panama Canal Zone by now. Over 4,000 American soldiers had been cycled through mustard gas tests. Many carried permanent scars. Some coughed blood every morning. Some could no longer see, yet the program continued. Each report filed upward. Each stamped, confidential. Inside a Washington office, a chemical warfare service colonel reviewed the files. His summary was cold, technical. Mustard gas confirmed effective irritant and casualty agent. American troops demonstrate varied tolerance. Recommend continuation of chamber tests until war's end. Results valuable for protective development. The colonel didn't mention Henry Adams, still bandaged from the burns of July 1942. He didn't mention Carlos Mendez, now blind. He didn't mention the hundreds coughing up their youth in infirmary beds. They weren't soldiers anymore. They weren't even men. They were subjects. December 1944, Edgewood Arsenal. The war raged across Europe. But here in Maryland, the real battlefield was sealed inside a chamber. Soldiers still marched in, still coughed, still screamed. The tests now had code names. Field Test 10, Chamber Trial 7, Uniform Control A. In the files, the results were praised. But in the barracks, whispers spread. Men talked about the burns, about the secret oaths, about how none of them would ever be the same. One whispered truth grew louder. The enemy hadn't used gas once in this war. The only ones breathing it were us. By the end of 1944, the U.S. had gathered enough data to fill warehouses. Blister charts, lung studies, racial comparisons, burn photographs. Yet all of it was locked away, stamped secret. The men were told to shut up. Told they had done their duty. Told it was for science. But in their bones, in their scars, in every cough that rattled their lungs, they knew the truth. Science hadn't saved them. Science had betrayed them, and still the tests weren't over. March 1st, 1945. Dugway Proving Ground, Utah. The desert stretched endless, a canvas of silence broken only by the rumble of army trucks. Dozens of soldiers, some barely 20, stood in formation in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains. They had been told this was for the war effort, that Japan might unleash gas in the Pacific, and America had to be ready. But even as they waited in the biting wind, rumors had spread. The enemy had never once used gas in this war. The only place mustard gas was killing soldiers was here, under the American flag. At 0900 hours, drums hissed open. The familiar yellow-brown fog uncoiled across the desert floor. The men held their masks tight. Some had done this before. Some bore scars from earlier tests. The officers with clipboards called them repeat subjects. Private Thomas Reed, already marked with burns from Edgewood the year before, felt the sting immediately. His scars reopened, blistering again under the chemical fog. He fell to his knees, crying out. The stopwatch ticked. A doctor muttered, "Subject 14 relapsed faster than expected." Another wrote, "Compare with last year's data." By noon, Reed was carried to the infirmary, eyes swollen shut, lungs rattling with each breath. His friends whispered that he wouldn't survive the month. The report that evening didn't mention his name. It simply read, "Relapse, subject 14. Healing duration reduced by 40%. May 8, 1945, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, Germany surrendered." Bells rang in New York. Crowds cheered in Times Square. But inside the sealed laboratories of Edgewood, nothing stopped. The war in Europe was over, but the science marched on. In a chamber test that morning, a group of soldiers stood in khaki uniforms, gas masks fogging under the lights. The hiss came, the fog rose. For 30 minutes they stood, coughing, choking, skin blistering. When it was done, the officers filed another report. Exposure trial successful. The war was over. The enemy was defeated. Yet still the gas was poured, still the bodies burned. For the men, victory didn't matter. Their war was against something invisible, something their own officers unleashed on them. August 14, 1945. Panama Canal. Zone Japan surrendered. The Second World War had ended. The guns were silent across Europe and Asia. But in the steaming jungles of Panama, experiments still continued. Soldiers were marched into dugouts. Gas was pumped. Bodies collapsed. They were told it was the last trial. Many prayed it was true. Some didn't live long enough to know. November 1945, Washington, D.C. The war was over. Families welcomed their boys home, but not all boys came home the same. Henry Adams returned to Kansas with arms scarred from burns that never healed. He could no longer grip a plow without pain. His neighbors asked what happened. He said nothing. He had sworn silence under the Espionage Act. Carlos Mendez returned to Puerto Rico, blind. The army gave him a medal, a folded flag, and nothing more. He lived in darkness, haunted by the last thing he saw, the yellow fog curling under his mask. John Lewis coughed blood every winter until the day he died. His lungs had been burned too many times. His family never knew why. All of them had signed papers. All had been warned. Speak, and you will face court-martial. So they said nothing. They carried their wounds in silence, buried under parades and speeches about victory. December 1945. Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. The last reports were filed, bound in leather covers, stamped, classified. They were not testimonies of pain, but statistics of suffering. Tables of blister size, graphs of lung collapse, comparisons by race. Pages of data stripped of faces, stripped of voices. The officers called it science. The Army called it national security. The men who lived it called it betrayal. For decades, no one knew. The records slept in vaults. The soldiers limped through life with scars on their bodies and silence on their tongues. They had been told they were protecting America. But in truth, America had poisoned its own. March 3, 1946. Wichita, Kansas. Henry Adams sat at his family's kitchen table, sleeves rolled up. The wheat harvest was coming, but his arms were useless. The scars from mustard gas were not just marks. They were wounds that never healed. Every time he tried to lift a sack of grain, the blisters split open, oozing yellow pus. His mother begged him to see a doctor. He did. The doctor shook his head. Chemical burns. Nothing to be done. Avoid sun. Avoid strain. Henry told him it had happened in training. The doctor raised an eyebrow. Training didn't scar men like this. But Henry couldn't explain. He had signed the papers. Speak, and you will be court-martialed. He went home in silence. October 12, 1947, San Juan. Puerto Rico. Carlos Mendez felt the warm hand of his daughter guide him through the crowded street. He had been blind since 1942. His Army discharge papers called it combat-related injury. But Carlos had never seen combat. His last battlefield had been a wooden hut in Florida, filled with gas. Neighbors asked how he lost his sight. He always said the same, the war. He never said more. May 18, 1950, Chicago, Illinois. John Lewis woke again, coughing blood into his bedsheets. His wife begged him to see a hospital. Doctors diagnosed chronic bronchitis, but John knew better. His lungs had been burning since San Jose Island, Panama, 1943. By now, dozens of other veterans had the same cough. Some coughed until they collapsed. Some developed lung cancers by 40. None of them could tell the truth. The Army's files were locked in Washington, stamped classified. The word volunteer covered every experiment. Volunteers had no right to complain. July 7, 1954, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. Inside the Arsenal's archives, rows of leather-bound binders sat untouched. Chamber trials, 1943. Tropical dugout tests, 1944. Protective uniform study, 1945. Thousands of pages of human suffering, reduced to numbers and graphs. An officer fresh out of West Point asked his superior why the files were sealed. The colonel didn't look up. National security. Our boys suffered so future ones wouldn't have to. Case closed. But the truth wasn't closed. It was rotting in men's bodies across the country. November 3rd, 1962, Montgomery. Alabama Robert Carter, a black veteran who had been locked in a chamber with 5 others in 1944, sat outside a VA hospital. He had been refused treatment. His burns had reopened again, itching and bleeding every summer. The clerk told him there was no record of chemical exposure. His service file listed only routine training. Carter laughed bitterly. Routine? They locked us in a box and poured hell inside. And now they say it never happened. No one answered. June 14th, 1965, Washington. D.C. In a closed meeting of the Department of Defense, a small team reviewed old chemical warfare documents. Some suggested destroying them to avoid embarrassment. Others argued to keep them sealed under top secret. One memo read, public acknowledgement of human experimentation during WWII would damage morale, invite lawsuits, and undermine trust. Recommend continued classification until further notice. And so the truth stayed buried. August 9th, 1968. New Orleans, Louisiana. Henry Adams, 55 years old, lay on his deathbed. His lungs were failing, scar tissue closing every breath. He asked his son to bring him the Army medal from the drawer. When the boy handed it over, Henry held it tight. He whispered, "They said it was for science," and then weaker, but it was just poison. By the late 1960s, thousands of men who had served under the flag were now scarred, blind, or buried. Yet the nation never knew. Their stories were censored, their files hidden. The war had ended in 1945, but for these soldiers, the war never ended. June 21st, 1973, Jacksonville, Florida. The bar smelled of tobacco and stale beer. A group of veterans sat at a corner table, their jackets patched with 45th Division insignias, their faces worn with decades. The jukebox played Hank Williams, but their conversation drowned it out. One of them, Samuel Reed, leaned forward. His hands trembled from neuropathy, his skin still scarred from burns that had never healed. "You know," he rasped, "I ain't never told my wife what really happened in Blanding." 40 years. Not a word, the others nodded. They too had been silent. Bound by oaths they barely remembered. Oaths signed in sweat and fear under the watchful eyes of officers with clipboards. But now, in this dim bar, their silence cracked. "They locked us in that goddamn chamber," Reed said. "Watched us scream, wrote notes while our skin boiled. And then they told us to call it training." Across the table, Robert Carter shook his head. His burns itched under his shirt. "Training. That's what they called it. And now the VA tells me they got no record. Nothing. Like we don't exist." For the first time in decades, they spoke the truth aloud. But outside that bar, nobody heard. November 4th, 1975, Washington, D.C. In a Pentagon office, dusty files were pulled from cabinets. The Freedom of Information Act had been passed, and journalists were filing requests. Among the files were thick binders marked Chemical Warfare Service, Confidential. Inside, photographs of blistered soldiers, chamber diagrams, exposure charts. For 30 years, they had been sealed. Now they were beginning to leak into daylight. A staff officer frowned. "If these get out, the press will hang us." His superior nodded. "Keep it quiet. Stall the requests." National security, but the cracks had begun to spread. July 17th, 1978, New York Times. Front page, the headline read, Army exposed U.S. soldiers to mustard gas in secret experiments. The article detailed chamber tests, island trials, racial comparisons. It quoted unnamed veterans, their voices trembling after decades of silence. We thought we were training for war, one said. But the war was against us. The story spread across the country. Families demanded answers. Widows asked why their husbands had died coughing, why their lungs had burned until the end. The Army denied at first. Officials called it limited exposure, necessary for defense. But the truth was out. The silence was broken. March 5, 1981, U.S. Congress hearing, Washington. The chamber was full. Veterans sat in rows, scars visible under rolled sleeves. Some wheezed into oxygen tanks, others blinked through cloudy corneas. They had waited 40 years for this moment. Chairman Alan Cranston leaned forward. Gentlemen, you are under oath. Please tell us what happened. Robert Carter stood, his voice shaking but strong. I was locked in a chamber in 1944. They pumped in mustard gas. My skin still burns every summer. The VA says I was never there, but I was. And they knew it. Gasps rippled through the room. Photographs were held up. Black and white images of soldiers covered in blisters, eyes swollen shut, lips cracked and bleeding. The generals at the witness table shifted uncomfortably. Their prepared statements about volunteers and necessary research crumbled under the weight of living testimony. For the first time, America heard the voices of its poisoned sons. October 22, 1988, Wichita. Kansas Henry Adams's grandson sat on the porch holding a government letter. It was an official acknowledgement from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We regret to inform you that your grandfather's injuries may have been the result of classified wartime chemical exposure. Compensation is hereby approved. The boy looked at his father. Why didn't Grandpa ever tell us? His father sighed. Because they told him not to. Because they made him swear silence. Because he was ashamed of what his own country did to him. The boy folded the letter. The scars were now 3 generations deep. April 15, 1991, Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. The hearing room echoed with the coughs of old men. Some in wheelchairs, some with oxygen tanks, some with bandages covering wounds that still wept after half a century. Senator John Glenn, himself a war hero, leaned forward. His voice was heavy with anger. Gentlemen, you went to war expecting to fight the enemy. Instead, the enemy was in your own ranks. This country owes you more than apologies. It owes you truth. The veterans nodded weakly. Some wept. Some stared ahead, remembering the hiss of gas and the burn on their skin. June 10, 1993. Declassification order. After 50 years, the U.S. government finally declassified thousands of pages. The reports confirmed everything. The chambers, the island trials, the race-based experiments. The files were released to libraries and archives. Historians pored over them. Journalists wrote exposés. The truth was now public record. But for many veterans, it was too late. Thousands had already died, their scars buried with them. Their families received letters of recognition, but no explanation for decades of silence. September 2, 1995. Arlington National Cemetery. A small group gathered around a headstone. The inscription read, Private Henry Adams, U.S. Army, 1923-1995, scarred in service. Silent in duty, his grandson placed a flower. His son whispered, they said it was for science. But it was poison. The words echoed across generations, a truth that could no longer be buried. Epilogue. American POV. When the war ended in 1945, the world celebrated victory. But for thousands of U.S. soldiers, the war never ended. They carried the burns, the blindness, the coughs, the cancers. They carried the silence. For decades, their own government denied them, erased them, silenced them. But in the end, the truth surfaced. The files were unsealed. The testimonies were spoken. The betrayal was laid bare. Science had promised protection. Instead, it delivered scars. And in the long shadow of Dachau, of Hiroshima, of mustard gas chambers on American soil, one truth remained. The enemy outside never used poison gas in WWII. Only America did, on its own men.